The American Civil War not only tore the country in half, but many families as well. Did you know that some Southerners fought for the Northern cause because they believed it was the only way to end slavery? And that some Northerners went south to join the Confederate Army because they believed at the onset of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln insisted that the Union must be held together at any cost, and that no state had the right to bow out. During the Civil War, which side was known as the Union? A. The North is correct.
After the Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861, several months passed without any real combat. The South consolidated its position in Northern Virginia. In the North, Union forces came to the realization that the war would take more than 90 days. The reality of the Confederate strength and determination was clear. The North hurried to increase the size of its army. In 1862, the Union began attacking rebel strongholds. Victory after victory followed for the North, with the South's army scurrying to protect its lines. But the cost in lives and suffering was often as great for the winning side as it was for the loser. That summer, General Robert E. Lee took over command of the Confederate Army. He had a different idea of how the war should be waged. Instead of waiting for attacks from the North, he pursued their forces and put them on the defensive. His strategy worked at first, but he gave up his plan to conquer the North on their own territory after the Battle of Antietam, September 16, 1862. In the wake of the Confederacy's success at the beginning of the Seven-Day Battle, both England and France appeared to be on the verge of recognizing the Confederate States of America. But Lee's failure to move beyond Antietam made the European powers reluctant to recognize the rebels. Both sides suffered greatly at this famous battle, but it was the Confederates who were driven back across the Potomac River. Although the Battle of Antietam was technically a draw, it was the North that really won. In the meantime, Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, a document which freed the slaves and brought world opinion to the side of the Union. The moment came, Lincoln later explained, when I felt slavery must die, that the nation might live. On September 23, 1862, just 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln published the Emancipation Proclamation. The night before, Lincoln gathered his cabinet and told them that he had made a pact with God to free the Southern slaves as soon as Lee was driven out of Maryland. Now that Lee had retreated, Lincoln had followed through. Meanwhile, the war raged on. Union forces followed the Confederates as they retreated south, and battle after battle was fought. Then, the tide turned again in June of 1863. Encouraged by successful battles, General Lee began to move north again, this time with an army of 75,000 men. They met a large Union force near the town of Gettysburg, and one of the most famous battles of the Civil War began. After 3 long days of fighting, What was left of Lee's army retreated from northern soil. The Battle of Gettysburg was the bloodiest of the war, with over 43,000 soldiers dead and at least as many wounded. The death and suffering caused by the war were beginning to destroy morale. But the two wounded armies regrouped and went on. Despite their losses, things were going well for the North. Northern General Ulysses S. Grant and his forces won control of the Mississippi River, a victory which literally split the Confederate States in two. This news was more devastating to the South than the grim news from Gettysburg. But in Washington, President Lincoln rejoiced. "The Father of waters," he said, "now flows unvexed to the sea." It was the beginning of the end for the South, but it was by no means the end. Things were coming apart inside the Confederate States. As Union armies swept through the South, they seized black slaves as Confederate contraband and then set them free. But the huge number of freed men created problems, and refugee camps were set up to accommodate them. At first, the blacks were used by Union forces as laborers, but over time they were given additional responsibilities, including guarding the camps they were in. Soon, whole regiments of blacks were forming, made up of blacks from both the North and South, with white officers over them. By the war's end, 150,000 blacks had enlisted in the Union Army and distinguished themselves bravely. Southerners were mortified to see their former slaves taking up arms against them. In the North, presidential election time was coming around again. It was the first time an election was ever held during wartime, and the result was an unpredictable campaign. In effect, the election became a judgment on the issue of the war itself. Lincoln and his Republicans argued for continuing the war, although there were divisions even here, and some of the more radical Republicans split from the party and nominated men who vowed to wage an even more horrific war in the South. The Democrats were, for the most part, opposed to continuing the war, and they nominated General McClellan on a peace platform. The party's proposal to end hostilities agreed with many Northern voters. Although Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in rebel territories, seemed to justify continuing the Northern cause, many Northerners were appalled by the casualties coming out of the struggle. Even when the Union won battles like Gettysburg and Shiloh, the dead numbered in the tens of thousands, and the people grew weary of a conflict that seemed like it would drag on forever. The war weariness of the North was a strain on voters, and the Democrats looked like they might carry the election. Even Lincoln seemed resigned to such a development. "It seems exceedingly probable," he wrote on the eve of the vote, "that my administration will not be re-elected. Then it will be my duty to cooperate with the President-elect to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterward." Yet despite the North's discontent, Lincoln won re-election, garnering 212 electoral votes to McClellan's 21. The nation, it seemed, had given Lincoln a mandate to continue the costly war against the South. Lincoln's generals continued to wage war against the rebels and started bringing news of victory after victory. By spring of 1865, the Confederacy was desperate. Its armies had been driven deep into the South, and Southern homes and outposts had been raided by Union soldiers and bands of outlaws. General Lee was faced with the choice of taking his men into the hills to wage a hopeless guerrilla war, or to surrender. Since the first option would cause more bloodshed and was sure to fail, he surrendered. On April 9, 1865, Lee ordered a white flag to be carried through the Union lines, and he requested a meeting with General Grant. A relieved Grant agreed to meet. The two generals met at the McLean House in the small town of Appomattox Courthouse. Lee and Grant exchanged courtesies, and then Grant wrote the terms of surrender in his own hand. Lee accepted Grant's offer and then rode off to his field headquarters. When news of Lee's surrender reached Union troops, they began to shout and fire off their guns and cannons in celebration. A somber Grant ordered the Union soldiers to stop. "The war is over," he told his men. "The rebels are our countrymen again." The terms of the surrender were gracious and lenient. Grant instructed Lee's men to lay down their arms and go home, promising them that they would pass unmolested by Union troops. Grant sent food wagons to feed the starved Confederate soldiers and offered them free transportation home on Union ships and railroads. Southern officers were permitted to keep their sidearms, and men were allowed to take horses home with them to work their farms. Northerners and Southerners, according to Grant, were again fellow Americans, and the healing process should begin. 3 days later, on April 12, 1865, Lee's men surrendered their arms. As the Confederates marched towards Appomattox Courthouse, Union forces saluted them in a gesture of respect and reconciliation. The Southerners were stunned by the Union's goodwill, and after they'd stacked their arms and laid down their colors, many broke down and wept. The end of the Civil War was at hand, and the liberal peace terms seemed to ensure the speedy healing promised in Lincoln's second inaugural address. "With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves." Reaching the point where a just and lasting peace was possible had been a costly endeavor. Over 600,000 Americans died in the Civil War, more than would die in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. In all, the Union armies lost 1/10 of all their fighting men to battle wounds and disease. The South, by some estimates, lost almost a quarter. Mortality among Confederate soldiers was higher because of inferior medical and surgical services in the South, but both sides were ravaged by disease. For every one soldier who died from his wounds on the battlefield, 2 died from the diseases and infections bred in the unsanitary camps. Thousands more died in the prisoner of war camps. It was well that the war was over and the reconciliation begun. The Civil War had caused too many casualties and too much suffering. But on April 14, 1865, just 2 days after Lee's surrender to Grant and 4 days before General Johnston's surrender to Sherman, President Lincoln took his wife and 2 friends to Ford's Theater to see Laura Keene in a play called Our American Cousin. The president reportedly wanted to see the play, which mentioned him by name. And, with the war almost won, Lincoln sat back and relaxed. The play was a good one, the atmosphere jovial. The soldier posted at the entrance of Lincoln's box to watch over the president was invited by someone, presumably one of the killer's accomplices, to a neighboring bar for a drink. The war was won, and it was time for a toast. That's when the assassin struck. At about 10:15, a pistol shot rang out. The president fell forward. Mortally wounded, Lincoln was removed to a lodging house opposite the theater, where he was laid out on a bed in a small back room and attended to through the night. His breathing was shallow, his pulse slow and weak. Despite a soaking rain, crowds gathered outside the hotel waiting for any news. At 7 a.m. on April 15, 1865, the horrible news was released. It stunned the country. Lincoln was dead. The man responsible for the killing was John Wilkes Booth, an actor and Southern sympathizer. For months, he had been plotting against Lincoln with a man named Lewis Payne. A famous photograph of Lincoln's second inauguration, taken just days before the assassination, captured both Wilkes and Payne as they stalked the doomed leader. At first, Booth and Payne had planned to kidnap Lincoln and take him to Richmond. But the two conspirators abandoned the plan when Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Instead, they hatched a plan to assassinate President Lincoln, General Grant, Vice President Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward. The plots against Grant and Johnson failed, but Lincoln was murdered and Seward severely stabbed in the mad plot to save the Confederacy. But if Booth thought the killing would rally the South and save the Confederacy, he was wrong. He couldn't even save himself. 12 days after the shooting, Booth was captured by Union soldiers near Port Royal, Virginia, and shot by Sergeant Boston Corbett, who collected $1,600 in reward for the killing. Booth's fellow conspirators were later hanged, together with the woman who had harbored them. The chance for national reconciliation now faded as radical Republicans who hated the South and sought to impose a punishing peace filled the vacuum left by Lincoln. They capitalized on the nation's grief and the general belief that the Confederates had been behind the assassination. They imposed harsh terms on the South that bore little resemblance to Lincoln's policy of goodwill. Hate and vengeance won out over reconciliation and the binding up of wounds. Despite calls to hang Confederate leaders for treason or probable involvement in the Lincoln assassination, only General Henry Wirz, the commander of the notorious Andersonville prison camp in Georgia, was actually hanged. A defiant Jefferson Davis spent 2 years in jail, but most Confederate generals expressed regret over Lincoln's death, urged their men to accept the inevitable and to work for the reunited country. But the cooperation of leading Southerners couldn't prevent racism and petty political maneuvering from poisoning the healing process. Had Lincoln not been killed, the bloodshed and persecution that followed might have been avoided. As he was buried, the hope of peace between Northerners and Southerners, and white and black, was buried too. The Civil War was over, but the bitterness and sorrow lived on. Time passed and erased some of the pain, and the men who fought the war returned to the battlefields 25 years, 40 years, even 50 years later. They remembered their victories and could not forget their terrible losses. The Union's victory destroyed the South's idea of what America should be and ensured that the North's vision would prevail over the whole United States. The American Civil War marked a turning point for the entire world.